Imagine standing at the edge of your own country, knowing that every border is a wall, every neighbor might be an informant, and every failed attempt to leave could end with a bullet in your back or a decade in a labor camp. This was the daily reality for roughly 280 million Soviet citizens during the Cold War. People who lived inside the largest country on Earth yet were forbidden from leaving it without explicit state permission. So, if you had been one of them, trapped behind the Iron Curtain, what would you have actually done to get out? And which of the 7 real paths people took would have given you the best chance of survival? Before we lay out those choices, you need to understand something that most people today find almost impossible to believe. The Soviet Union did not merely discourage emigration, it criminalized it. Article 64 of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic's Criminal Code classified unauthorized departure from the country as treason, punishable by 10 to 15 years of imprisonment or, in especially egregious cases, execution. The borders were not symbolic lines on a map. They were physical kill zones. The Soviet frontier stretched over 60,000 kilometers, and by the 1970s, vast sections of it were reinforced with barbed wire, plowed control strips to detect footprints, watchtowers manned around the clock, guard dogs, motion sensors, and standing orders to shoot anyone attempting to cross without authorization. Even approaching certain border zones without a special permit was itself a crime. The entire system was designed around a single terrifying premise. You belong to the state, and the state decides whether you stay or go. That premise shaped the lives of generations, but across 7 decades of Soviet power, from 1917 to 1991, thousands of people defied it. Some made it out, many did not. Their stories reveal 7 distinct strategies, 7 doors people tried to open, each with its own odds, its own costs, and its own brand of terror. And the one that might surprise you most is the path that required no physical escape at all. The first choice was the most obvious and the most dangerous, a direct, unauthorized border crossing. Running. This is the image most people conjure when they think about escaping a totalitarian state, and for good reason. It is the most cinematic option, and it is also the one with the highest body count. The Soviet border guards, known as the Pogranichny Voyska, were a dedicated branch of the KGB with over 200,000 personnel by the late Cold War. Their mission was singular. No one gets through. The most fortified sections ran along the western frontier, separating the USSR from Finland, from NATO-aligned Turkey, and from the satellite states that themselves had hardened borders, the most infamous being the Berlin Wall. But even the less discussed borders were lethal. The Soviet-Iranian border in the Caucasus, the Soviet-Chinese border stretching across Central Asia, and the frozen Arctic coastline all had their own grim histories of failed crossings. Consider the case of the Gimbutas family. In 1944, as Soviet forces swept back into Lithuania, tens of thousands of Lithuanians fled westward on foot, through forests and across rivers, trying to reach the Baltic coast and from there Sweden. Many were caught, many drowned, many froze. Those who made it often did so by traveling only at night, hiding in barns and haystacks during the day, guided by farmers who risked their own lives to point the way. The window for this kind of mass flight was narrow, limited to the chaos of wartime, when border infrastructure was still being established. Once the Iron Curtain solidified in the late 1940s, running became exponentially more dangerous. And yet people still tried. In 1962, a young East German named Peter Fechter was shot by border guards while trying to climb the Berlin Wall. He fell back on the eastern side and lay in the death strip, bleeding, crying for help, for nearly an hour while guards on both sides watched. He died there. His death became an international scandal, but it changed nothing about the policy. The orders remained. If someone runs, you shoot. Across the entire Cold War, an estimated at least 140 people were killed trying to cross the Berlin Wall alone. The numbers along the broader Soviet frontier are harder to pin down, with some estimates running into the thousands, though Soviet-era records remain incomplete and many cases were simply never documented. If you are watching this and the mechanics of how states trap their own people fascinate you or disturb you, then consider subscribing. This channel exists to pull apart the hidden machinery of Soviet and Cold War history, the decisions, the systems, and the human stories that textbooks often flatten into paragraphs. There is much more to uncover, and the community here is built around exactly that, now. If a direct border crossing was nearly suicidal, what about the second choice, escaping by sea? This was, in some ways, even more audacious, but it offered one advantage that land crossings did not. Water is harder to fence. The Soviet Union had extensive coastlines along the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, the Arctic Ocean, and the Pacific. And throughout the Cold War, a small number of people attempted to escape by boat, by swimming, or even by constructing improvised watercraft. One of the most extraordinary maritime escapes occurred in 1974, when a Lithuanian sailor named Simas Kudirka attempted to defect by leaping from a Soviet fishing vessel onto the deck of a United States Coast Guard cutter, the Vigilant, off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. What happened next was a catastrophe of bureaucratic cowardice. The American officers, uncertain of protocol and afraid of creating a diplomatic incident, allowed Soviet sailors to board the Coast Guard vessel and drag Kudirka back. He was beaten unconscious in front of American servicemen. He was taken back to the Soviet Union, tried, and sentenced to 10 years of hard labor. The incident provoked outrage when it became public, eventually leading to Kudirka's release years later after it was discovered he had a claim to American citizenship through his mother. But his case illustrates a brutal truth about the sea escape. Even if you reached a Western vessel, even if you physically stood on what should have been free soil, politics could still send you back. Others were more fortunate. In 1979, a Georgian family, the Churchillanis, built a homemade hot air balloon, and while this technically falls into another category, the principle applies. Maritime escapes often required engineering. In the Baltic states, some fishermen used their knowledge of currents and patrol schedules to slip across to Sweden under cover of darkness, and a handful succeeded. But Soviet naval patrols were extensive. Coastal radar covered most of the Baltic and Black Sea shorelines, and any vessel heading toward international waters without authorization was subject to interception. The odds were not good, but they were not zero. The third choice was perhaps the most psychologically complex: defection during authorized travel abroad. This was the path available only to a tiny elite: diplomats, athletes, ballet dancers, musicians, scientists, and military officers. These were the people the Soviet state trusted enough or needed enough to send beyond its borders. And for precisely that reason, they were watched more closely than anyone. Every Soviet delegation traveling to the West included KGB minders whose sole job was to ensure no one slipped away. Hotel rooms were shared. Movements were monitored. Passports were often confiscated and held by the delegation leader. The price of defection was also not limited to the individual. The Soviet system practiced a form of collective punishment known informally as hostage logic. If you defected, your family back home would suffer. Parents could lose their jobs. Siblings could be expelled from universities. Spouses could be interrogated, harassed, or worse. Despite all of this, defections happened with startling regularity. The most famous is arguably that of Rudolf Nureyev, the ballet dancer who, in June 1961, broke free from his KGB handlers at Le Bourget airport in Paris and threw himself into the arms of French police requesting asylum. The decision took seconds. He had been told he was being recalled to Moscow, almost certainly to be punished for socializing too freely with Western acquaintances. He knew that if he boarded that plane, his career, and possibly his freedom, were over. So he ran. The French granted him asylum. He never returned to the Soviet Union, and he did not see his mother again for over 2 decades. His defection was a propaganda earthquake. The Soviets denounced him as a traitor. The West celebrated him as a symbol of artistic freedom. But behind the headlines there was a man who had made an irreversible choice in the span of a heartbeat, knowing he was severing every connection to everyone he had ever loved. The athlete, Vitaly Yurchenko, presents a stranger and darker variation. In 1985, Yurchenko, a high-ranking KGB officer, defected to the CIA in Rome. He was debriefed extensively. He provided valuable intelligence. And then, 3 months later, he walked out of a restaurant in Georgetown, Washington, D.C., crossed the street to the Soviet embassy, and redefected. He held a press conference claiming he had been kidnapped and drugged by the Americans. To this day, intelligence analysts debate whether his original defection was genuine, whether his return was voluntary, or whether the entire episode was a Soviet intelligence operation. The Yurchenko case is a reminder that defection was not just a physical act. It was a psychological labyrinth, and some people, once they stepped into it, could not find their way through. The fourth path out was emigration through official channels, and this was the slowest, most grinding, and in many ways the most humiliating route. On paper, Soviet citizens could apply for permission to emigrate. In practice, the process was designed to be so punitive that it functioned as its own form of deterrence. When you applied for an exit visa, you were immediately marked. You lost your job, often your spouse lost theirs. Your children could be expelled from school. You became what was known as a refusenik, a term that originally applied to Soviet Jews who were refused permission to emigrate to Israel but came to encompass anyone trapped in the bureaucratic purgatory of a denied exit visa. The refusenik movement became one of the most significant human rights struggles of the Cold War. Natan Sharansky, a Jewish mathematician and dissident, applied to emigrate in 1973. His application was denied. He became an activist, advocating publicly for the right to leave. In 1977, he was arrested and charged with espionage and treason. He was sentenced to 13 years of forced labor. He spent years in the notorious Perm 36 labor camp and in punishment cells where temperatures dropped below freezing. He was not released until 1986 as part of a prisoner exchange on the Gulag Bridge in Berlin, the same bridge where Cold War spy swaps had become almost ritualistic. Sharansky's case drew global attention and helped build international pressure on the Soviet Union to relax emigration restrictions. But for every Sharansky whose name became known, there were thousands of anonymous refuseniks who waited years, sometimes decades, in professional and social limbo, with no guarantee the door would ever open. Here is a statistic that puts the scale into perspective. Between 1970 and 1988, approximately 500,000 Soviet Jews applied to emigrate. Roughly 350,000 were eventually allowed to leave. The rest were denied, many of them repeatedly. And these were people who had a relatively strong international advocacy network behind them. For ordinary Soviet citizens without a recognized ethnic or religious claim, the chances of receiving an exit visa were vanishingly small. The fifth choice was tunneling, and by this I mean not just literal tunnels, though those existed, but the broader category of engineered escapes that required construction, invention, and technical ingenuity. The Berlin Wall became the laboratory for this kind of escape, and some of the operations that took place there read like action movie scripts, except they were real, and the consequences of failure were real too. In 1964, a group of students and activists, many of them from West Berlin's Free University, dug a tunnel roughly 145 meters long, starting from a bakery on the western side of Bernauer Strasse and emerging in the basement of a building on the eastern side. The tunnel was barely 70 centimeters wide and was dug over 6 months in conditions of extreme secrecy. On the nights of October 3rd and 4th, 1964, 57 people crawled through that tunnel to freedom. It became known as Tunnel 57, and it remains one of the most successful single escape operations of the Cold War. But not every tunnel story ended well. Several tunnels were betrayed by informants. In at least one case, East German border guards flooded a tunnel while people were inside it. The Stasi, East Germany's secret police, eventually developed ground-penetrating microphones and other detection technologies, specifically to counter tunneling. Beyond tunnels, people escaped in modified cars with hidden compartments welded into the chassis. They escaped in hollowed-out surfboards. They escaped by zip-lining across the wall on a homemade cable. They escaped in a pair of ultra-light aircraft. Each of these methods required not just courage, but a specific kind of creative intelligence. The ability to look at a system designed to be escape-proof and find the single flaw, the one gap in the logic. The sixth choice was perhaps the most paradoxical, using the Soviet system's own ideology against it. This was the path of dissidents, the people who did not try to physically escape but instead tried to create enough international pressure that the system would be forced to release them. This required a different kind of courage, the willingness to stay inside the machine and let it grind against you while the world watched. Andrei Sakharov, the physicist who helped design the Soviet hydrogen bomb, became the most prominent example of this strategy. By the late 1960s, Sakharov had turned against the weapons program and become a vocal advocate for human rights and nuclear disarmament. He published essays that were smuggled to the West. He supported other dissidents. He spoke publicly in ways that no one of his stature had dared. The Soviet government could not simply make him disappear. He was too famous, too closely watched by the international press. Instead, in 1980, they exiled him to the closed city of Gorky, now Nizhny Novgorod, where he was kept under constant KGB surveillance, denied contact with foreign journalists, and subjected to force feeding during his hunger strikes. He was not released until 1986, when Mikhail Gorbachev personally called him and told him he could return to Moscow. Sakharov's story is the story of a man who made himself too important to kill and too principled to silence. But it took 6 years of internal exile, the destruction of his health, and enormous suffering for that strategy to work. And it only worked because the geopolitical context shifted. Without glasnost and perestroika, Sakharov might have died in Gorky. Alexander Solzhenitsyn followed a related but distinct trajectory. His novels, especially One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich and the Gulag Archipelago, exposed the reality of the Soviet labor camp system to the world. The Gulag Archipelago was smuggled out of the Soviet Union on microfilm and published in Paris in 1973. The KGB had been hunting for the manuscript for years. When it was published, the regime was humiliated. In February 1974, Solzhenitsyn was arrested, stripped of his citizenship, and physically put on a plane to West Germany. He did not choose to leave. He was expelled. And, in a strange way, his expulsion was itself a confession by the Soviet state that it could not withstand the power of one man telling the truth on paper. And this brings us to the seventh choice, the one that is often overlooked and yet was statistically the most common path to freedom: waiting. Simply surviving inside the system until the system itself collapsed. This might sound passive, even defeatist, but consider what it actually required. It required enduring decades of surveillance, shortages, ideological absurdity, censorship, and the constant low-level terror of knowing that one wrong word, one wrong association, one wrong joke told in the wrong company could ruin your life. It required raising children inside a system you did not believe in while pretending, for their safety and yours, that you did. It required what the Czech dissident Václav Havel called living within a lie and finding within that lie some private space of truth that kept you sane. Millions of people made this choice, not because they were cowards, but because the other six options were either unavailable to them or too dangerous. They did not have the athletic talent to be sent abroad. They did not live near a border. They did not have the engineering skills to build a tunnel or a hot air balloon. They did not have the international profile to become a dissident whose imprisonment would embarrass the regime. They were ordinary people, teachers, factory workers, doctors, clerks, and their strategy was simply to endure. And then, in 1989, the wall fell. Not because a tunnel was dug, not because a dancer defected, not because a Refusenix hunger strike finally worked, although all of these things contributed to the moral pressure that weakened the system. It fell because of a cascading series of political miscalculations, economic failures, and one extraordinary press conference on the evening of November 9th. 1989, when an East German spokesman named Günter Schabowski, reading from a poorly briefed set of notes, announced new travel regulations and, when asked when they would take effect, stumbled and said, "Immediately, without delay." Within hours, thousands of East Berliners were streaming through the checkpoints. The guards, receiving no clear orders to stop them, stepped aside. The wall, which had stood for 28 years and killed at least 140 people, was dismantled not by an army but by a bureaucratic error and a crowd that decided all at once that the lie was over. By 1991, the Soviet Union itself was gone. The borders opened, the exit visas became irrelevant, the Refuseniks could leave, the dissidents were rehabilitated, the dead, of course, remained dead. Peter Fechter, bleeding out in the death strip in 1962, never saw it. The unnamed Lithuanians who froze in the forests in 1944 never saw it. The thousands who disappeared into the Gulag for the crime of wanting to leave never saw it. What the seven choices reveal, taken together, is something more than a catalogue of escape methods. They reveal the architecture of a system that treated human mobility, one of the most basic expressions of freedom, as a threat to state security. Every path out, whether it involved running, swimming, defecting, applying, digging, protesting, or waiting, required the individual to calculate the same grim equation. What am I willing to lose, and what am I willing to risk, for the chance to live on the other side of a line that someone else drew? There is an uncomfortable resonance here with the present. As of the early 2020s, there are still countries where citizens cannot freely leave, where exit visas are required, where passports are confiscated, where borders are designed to keep people in rather than keep people out. The mechanisms are different, the technology is more sophisticated, the ideological justifications have shifted. But the fundamental dynamic, a state claiming ownership over the bodies and movements of its citizens, has not disappeared from the earth. The Soviet Union is gone, but the question it posed to every person living inside it persists. If the walls went up around you tomorrow, which of the seven choices would you make? And more importantly, would you even have a choice at all? The answer, for most people who lived behind the Iron Curtain, was that choice itself was a luxury. The defectors who leapt onto Western ships, the dancers who sprinted through airports, the families who crawled through tunnels, they were not ordinary. They were exceptional, driven by desperation or talent or circumstance into moments where action became possible. For the vast majority, The seventh path, endurance, was not chosen so much as imposed, and the final irony of the Soviet experiment is this: a system built to last 1,000 years, a system that constructed the most elaborate apparatus of human containment in modern history, was outlasted by the people it tried to contain. They waited. And eventually the walls came down, not because the walls were weak, but because the lie that held them up finally ran out of believers.